Have you ever wondered what it was like to be inside a Soviet tank when it got hit? Not the Hollywood version, but the actual horrifying reality that Soviet tankers faced every single day of the war. We're talking about men who had a 50-50 chance at best of escaping their burning tank before it became their coffin. And today we're going to tell you exactly why Soviet tanks, particularly the legendary T-34, were death traps for the very men who operated them. Some of the details you're about to hear are disturbing, but they're part of a story that needs to be told. The story of how the most produced tank of World War II also became one of the deadliest for its own crews. By the way, before we dive in, I've analyzed hundreds of Soviet combat reports and crew testimonies to bring you the real story behind these machines. This isn't just about specs and armor thickness. This is about the men who climbed into these steel boxes knowing their odds of survival were worse than a coin flip. When the T-34 first rolled off the production lines in 1940, Soviet designers thought they'd created something revolutionary. And in many ways, they had. The sloped armor was brilliant. The 76mm gun was powerful for its time, and the Christie suspension gave it mobility that German tanks couldn't match. But here's what they didn't advertise in the propaganda posters. The same design choices that made the T-34 effective on paper made it a nightmare for the four men trapped inside. Let's start with the most obvious problem: the turret. The early T-34 used a two-man turret that was originally designed for a 45mm gun. Now imagine cramming a much larger 76mm gun into that same cramped space, along with all the ammunition it needed. The result was a turret so tight that the commander had to act as the gunner, the loader, and somehow still command the tank and observe the battlefield, all at the same time. From a position with visibility so poor he might as well have been wearing a blindfold. Think about that for a second. You're the tank commander. You need to scan for threats, communicate with your crew, aim the gun, coordinate with other tanks, and load shells. Oh, and you need to do all of this while German anti-tank guns are trying to kill you. The Germans quickly figured out that Soviet tanks were practically blind. They'd watch T-34s drive right past them, completely unaware of the threat because the commander was too busy trying to do three jobs at once to actually see what was happening around him. But the turret design had an even more sinister problem: the hatch. That single piece of steel on top of the turret that both the commander and loader had to share. It was so heavy and awkwardly designed that you'd need superhuman strength to open it quickly. Now picture this. Your tank just took a hit. Flames are spreading through the crew compartment. The ammunition is about to cook off, and you're desperately trying to shove open a hatch that weighs as much as a small person while your loader is also trying to get out through the same opening. Soviet tankers called it the coffin lid, and for good reason. The driver had it even worse. He sat in the front of the hull, squeezed behind that famous sloped armor that everyone praises. But here's what that sloped armor meant for him. He had to sit in an awkward, cramped position with his forward opening hatch directly above him. In theory, he could escape through it. In practice, after the tank took a hit, that hatch would often jam from the impact. And even if it didn't jam, try to picture opening a hatch that swings forward while you're sitting in a burning tank with flames and smoke filling the compartment. Most drivers who survived did so by climbing back through the turret, assuming the turret crew had already gotten out and assuming there was time. And then there was the bow gunner in the early models. This poor soul sat in the hull with a machine gun, staring through a tiny hole next to his weapon. He had no hatch. None. His only way out was through the turret or the driver's hatch. When the tank got hit, he had the worst survival odds of anyone in the crew. The Soviets eventually realized this was insane and removed the position in later models, but not before thousands of bow gunners died trapped in burning hulls. Now let's talk about what happened when a Soviet tank actually got hit, because this is where the design flaws turned from inconvenient to lethal. The Soviets used a special steel alloy for their armor. It was hard, which was good for stopping shells, but it was also brittle, which was catastrophic for the crew. When a German anti-tank round hit a T-34, even if it didn't penetrate, the impact would cause the armor to spall, That's the technical term for chunks of steel peeling off the inside of the armor and turning into shrapnel that ricocheted around the crew compartment at lethal speeds. Imagine sitting inside a metal box when someone hits the outside with a sledgehammer. Except instead of just noise, pieces of the box itself start flying at you like bullets. Soviet tankers would be killed or wounded by their own armor, even when the enemy shell didn't make it through. American studies during the Korean War found that when anti-tank rounds penetrated a T-34, 75% of the crew died. 75%. Compare that to the Sherman, where only 18% of the crew died from penetrating hits. The difference wasn't just the armor. It was everything about how the tank was designed. And we haven't even gotten to the ammunition storage yet. Soviet designers stored shells in racks along the hull sides, in floor stowage, and in ready racks in the turret. There was no separation between the crew and the ammunition, no armored compartments, no blowout panels like the Americans would later develop. The crew literally sat surrounded by high explosive shells. And here's the kicker. Soviet ammunition was more prone to catching fire than German or American ammunition. Nobody knows exactly why, whether it was the propellant composition or the storage methods, but Soviet tankers knew that when their tank got hit, the ammo would probably ignite. When those shells cooked off, the results were catastrophic. The turret would blow clean off the hull, launched into the air by the force of the ammunition exploding. You've probably seen photos of T-34s with their turrets sitting 10 meters away from the chassis. That's not because of a massive German gun. That's because the ammunition inside detonated, and if you were still in the tank when that happened, well, there wasn't enough left of you for a proper burial. The statistics tell the story better than anything else. Soviet tankers had roughly a 50% chance of escaping a knocked-out tank. Some sources put it as low as 20%. Compare that to American Sherman crews, who had about an 80% survival rate. The Sherman got a reputation as a death trap, nicknamed the Ronson Lighter because it supposedly lit up on the first strike. But the numbers don't lie. You were far more likely to survive a hit in a Sherman than in a T-34. The Soviets just didn't talk about it. But wait, you might be thinking, didn't the Soviets fix these problems? They did try. In 1944, they introduced the T-34-85, which addressed some of the most glaring issues. The new turret was finally big enough for 3 men, with a dedicated gunner and loader, freeing up the commander to actually command. The 85mm gun gave them a fighting chance against German Panthers and Tigers. And they added a proper commander's cupola with all-around vision. It was a massive improvement. But even the T-34-85 couldn't fix the fundamental problems. The ammunition was still stored throughout the crew compartment. The armor still spalled when hit. The driver's hatch still opened forward and could still jam. And the Soviets were still rushing these tanks out of factories so fast that quality control was basically non-existent. Welds were poor, allowing rain to seep in and cause electrical failures. Components were simplified to speed production, which meant more breakdowns. The T-34-85 was better, but it was still a dangerous place to be when the shooting started. Now let's talk about the threats these crews faced, because understanding what killed them helps explain why the design flaws were so deadly. Early in the war, German anti-tank guns struggled against the T-34's armor. The 37mm gun was useless. Even the 50mm had trouble with frontal hits, but the Germans adapted quickly. By 1942, they had the Pak-40, a 75mm anti-tank gun that could punch through a T-34 at reasonable range. They mounted the same gun on Panzer IVs and assault guns. Suddenly, Soviet armor advantage evaporated. The Pak-40 didn't just penetrate, it used shells with explosive filler. So when it went through your armor, it didn't just make a hole, it exploded inside the tank. The combination of the penetrating round, the explosion, the spalling armor, and the inevitable ammunition fire meant that getting hit by a Pak-40 was usually fatal for most of the crew. German gunners were trained to aim for specific weak points. The turret ring where the turret met the hull, the driver's hatch, the lower hull where the armor was thinner. They knew exactly where to hit to maximize crew casualties, but the Pak-40 wasn't even the worst threat. That honor goes to the Panzerfaust. This handheld anti-tank weapon was crude, inaccurate, and had terrible range. But in close combat, especially in cities, it was absolutely devastating. The Panzerfaust used a shaped charge that would melt through armor, sending a jet of superheated metal into the crew compartment. Imagine molten steel spraying through your tank at thousands of degrees. It would burn through clothing, through skin, through everything, and it would ignite the ammunition instantly. By the later stages of the war, Panzerfausts were responsible for about 70% of destroyed tanks. The Germans produced over 8 million of them. Every German soldier in the path of a Soviet advance potentially had one. And they killed more crew members per destroyed tank than anti-tank guns did, because of how the shaped charge worked. There was no warning, no chance to react. Just a sudden blast of molten metal and fire. Soviet tankers developed a fatalistic attitude about their chances. They knew the odds. They knew that every time they climbed into their tank, they might not climb out. Some crews would leave the hatches open during combat against regulations, because they knew that those extra seconds could mean the difference between escape and death. Others would carry fewer shells than authorized, trying to reduce the risk of ammunition fires. But orders were orders, and most of the time they went into battle fully loaded, sitting on top of their own funeral pyre. The training didn't help. Early in the war, Soviet tank training was almost non-existent. Crews got a few hours of instruction and were sent to the front. They didn't know how to use their equipment effectively. They didn't understand tactics. They couldn't coordinate with other tanks because most of them didn't have radios. They would bunch up, making themselves easy targets. They couldn't locate where enemy fire was coming from because the visibility was so poor. And they would return inaccurate fire because the commander was too busy trying to do everything at once. German after-action reports describe Soviet tank attacks as chaotic and uncoordinated. Tanks would advance without infantry support, without reconnaissance, without any real plan. They'd drive straight into ambushes. German gunners reported that they could often get off 3 or 4 accurate shots for everyone coming from a T-34, not because the German tanks were better armed, but because the German crews could actually see what they were shooting at, and had dedicated gunners who weren't also trying to command the tank. The Soviets did eventually improve their training and tactics. By 1943 and 1944, Soviet tank crews were far more effective. They learned to coordinate with infantry and artillery. They learned to use reconnaissance. They learned not to bunch up, but the fundamental design flaws of the tanks themselves never went away. A better trained crew in a T-34 still had worse survival odds than a mediocre crew in a Sherman. And here's the thing that really drives it home. The Soviets knew about these problems. They had reports from the front. They had testimony from surviving crews. They knew that the 2-man turret was a disaster. They knew about the spalling. They knew about the ammunition fires. But they made a calculated decision. It was more important to produce tanks in massive numbers than to produce better tanks in smaller numbers. The T-34 was designed from the start to be a mobilization tank, something that could be built quickly and in huge quantities. And it worked in a brutal, calculating way. The Soviets produced 57,000 T-34s during the war. They lost tens of thousands of them, but there were always more tanks and always more crews to put in them. The individual crew's survival didn't matter in the grand strategic picture. What mattered was that there were always more tanks rolling toward Berlin than the Germans could destroy. It's a cold equation, but it's the one that won the war on the Eastern Front. The human cost of that strategy is almost impossible to comprehend. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet tankers died during the war. Many of them burned to death in their tanks. Others were killed by spalling or ammunition explosions. Some were wounded and trapped, dying slowly as their tank burned around them. The survivors carried the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Burns, missing limbs, nightmares about being trapped in a burning steel box. One Soviet tanker later described the moment his T-34 was hit. He said the world turned to fire and noise. The ammunition cooked off almost immediately. He was blown out through the hatch by the explosion, his clothes on fire, his skin burned. The rest of his crew died inside. He said he could hear them screaming for a few seconds before the ammunition fully detonated and the screaming stopped. He was one of the lucky ones. He survived. These weren't just statistics or numbers on a page. These were men, most of them barely out of their teens, who climbed into machines that they knew were death traps because their country demanded it. They fought with incredible bravery in tanks that were designed with their survival as an afterthought, and they won. Not because their tanks were better, but because there were more of them and because they were willing to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable to Western armies. The T-34 is often called the best tank of World War II, and in terms of its impact on the war, that might be true. It was produced in numbers that overwhelmed the Germans. It was good enough to fight effectively when properly used, and it kept getting better as the war went on. But for the men who had to fight in them, the T-34 was a death trap. The design flaws that made it easy to produce also made it deadly to its crew. The sloped armor that made it hard to penetrate also caused lethal spalling. The compact design that made it easy to build also made it impossible to escape. So the next time you see a T-34 in a museum or in a documentary, remember the men who died inside them. Remember that every one of those tanks rolling toward Berlin carried 4 men who knew they probably wouldn't survive the war. Remember that the Soviet victory came at a price paid in the burned and broken bodies of tankers who deserved better than the machines they were given. The T-34 won the war, but it killed its own crews to do it. And that's the truth that the propaganda posters never showed.